The Philippines, a past revisiting by Renato Constantino. The concept of nationhood emerged from the multifaceted ideology of rebellion against the Spaniards. Despite the recognition towards hideous deeds of the colonizers, unity is still nowhere to be found, not until the emergence of different personalities had awakened their aims towards freeing themselves. This gave birth to various representations of reforms that started peacefully but eventually transitioned into a revolutionary manner. After several attempts and peaceful agitations of reforms, this chapter shines light in the birth of Katipunan, as Andres Bonifacio was convinced that the only way to freedom was suppression and the only means is revolution. But there were dismaying drawbacks. The people's biggest betrayal to its own blood. Thirst for power met the failure of the revolution. A vicious struggle for Philippine independence from Spain left him 6 feet underground. And what's worst is that he did not die in the hands of the Spaniard. He died in the hands of his own people, the Filipinos, who he fought hard for freedom. America had an opportunity to gain sympathy from countries colonized by Spain after a mysterious event angered the Westerners. A truce was gained, and Filipinos tested more than we should be. It was yet another false pledge made to our homeland, and Aguinaldo's judgment did more harm than good. Spain was successfully expelled, but Americans patiently waited for this time to come. The regime of Aguinaldo had instead deteriorated the trust of the Filipinos. His desire, along with the Ilustrados, hindered the aspirations of the people and soon showed the administration's motives towards personal gains from economic progress and neglect the Filipinos' welfare and right for independence. Further, his decisions and actions once again led to the failure of the nation to free its people.
The lack of communication, education, and new information have kept the people ignorant that further delayed the national consciousness. The Ilustrados, on the other hand, who rose from the developing national economy, became the early spokesman for the people's grievances and aspiration. Along with that was the emergence of the new Filipinos being the Españoles Filipinos or the Creoles. They were the Spaniards born in the Philippines, and the Chinese mestizos and urbanized natives became Filipinos as for their Hispanic cultural background. This emergence has also mediated the progression of the concept of Filipino from a racial and elitist derivation to describing the inhabitants within the Philippine archipelago. Meanwhile, the nationhood of the people has given birth to agitation for reforms. The propaganda movement had been formed as the foundation of the movements by the suspected filibusteros, including the Españoles Filipinos and Spanish mestizo. The young men who were sent to Spain having Gracian Lopez Haina, who wrote a tale whose principal concept was Fray Botod, depicting the greed, vices, and abuses of the Spaniard press. Marcelo H. Del Pilar, who was a distinct propagandist and inhibited a common touch to his audiences. And Dr. Jose P. Rizal, who was a highly respected leader and known for his intellect that has led to the publication of Noli Me Tangere in 1887. Lastly were the expatriates, refugees, and students who envisioned demands for reforms, counteract de la Política de España en Filipinas, and several anti-Filipino writers. Subsequently, various agitations have also risen, including the Españoles Filipino in El Eco Filipino, which inhibited early demands for reform but ended in 1872. The Círculo Hispano, formed by Juan Atayde in 1882, and the Asociación Hispano-Filipino initiated by Professor Miguel Moraita. Although these attempts have failed, the La Solidaridad came into existence in Barcelona on February 15, 1889 until November 15, 1895. This became the principal organ of the movement after the preceding years. The paper has demanded freedom for the Filipinos, educational opportunities, and a stop to oppression and arbitrary deportation. Notwithstanding their goals, the propagandists were also directed towards assimilation through making the Philippines a province of Spain and representation in the Spanish Cortes. Despite the turmoil and failures caused by the lack of funds, propagandist disputes, and language barriers, the movement's impact has flourished in some ways, reaching the local ilustrados. This led to the rising of revolutionary forces in the provinces through the people's efforts and the emergence of Masonry, where its lodges have helped the fundings of the movement. However, when Rizal returned to the Philippines in 1892, he, along with Bonifacio, had organized the Liga Filipina, which sought to involve the people directly in the reform movement. Unfortunately, the ideologies he envisioned have led to his arrest. After Liga became inactive due to the arrest, Domingo Franco and Bonifacio reorganized it. Despite the great efforts by Bonifacio, Liga Filipina dissolved after a few months due to lack of support and the idea of Bonifacio, which instigated that peaceful agitations are pointless. Thereafter, the split of the membership happened. The Cuerpo de Compromisarios, which was formed by the conservatives, which directed continuous support to La Solidaridad. The Katipunan, on the other hand, was led by Bonifacio, comprising the idea of revolution. During those times, higher economic status meant a stronger tendency towards assimilation and reformism. The economic progress has given birth to several transitional economic, social groups, and board petty bourgeois stratum. The majority were able to accept most of the teachings of the Ilustrados, as the idea of the Spanish hierarchical organization made it easier to accept and think of having natural social superiors. Much more, the progress had yielded awareness of common deprivation and oppression. The employment of more than 20,000 workers in 5 tobacco monopoly factories created convergence that has developed recognition of their solidarity interests as Filipinos, but not yet as proletarians. This partial sense of solidarity resulted in constituting a foundation of support towards the Katipunan. However, economic progress depressed the living standards of the masses. These were evident in the development of cash crops for exports, which intensified exploitation and sufferings. An annual increase of land rentals, forcing of tenants to focus on cash crops, destroyed farm income due to imports, increased value and desirability of owning lands, and taking advantage of the laws by the affluent. Further, the anger of the poor radiated towards the new owners of the land to which it was owned by their ancestors. The exploitative practices of the friar estate administrators were prevalently emphasizing the land-grabbing activities, which has yielded further resentments of the people. Their grievances did not end there but were enriched due to immediate causes. The Filipino laborer and small producers were affected due to the disastrous falling of hemp and sugar prices, along with the rise of imported goods. Bankruptcy of coffee planters due to cankers and paralyzation of indigo production. Locust infestations which destroyed the rice fields of the provinces of Central Luzon. And several calamities which, regardless of such events, there were no favorable considerations toward the people. There were distinct grievances among different classes which had converged into forming one common stream of national protest, incorporating the advent of a revolutionary movement that resulted in organizing the Katipunan with a broader mass base.
Bonifacio, Emilio Jacinto, and other Katipunan leaders explored San Mateo and Montalban mountains in 1894. The preparation was a struggle, for only spears, bolos, and a few shotguns are the only means of weapons for the Filipinos. With the help of propaganda, Emilio Jacinto handled the Kalayaan newspaper to further spread the revolution. As Katipunan expanded, secrecy became difficult. On August 19, 1896, Teodoro Patino, a worker at the Diario de Manila, told Father Mariano Hill of Tondo about the Katipunan. During questioning, Patino named his Katipunero co-workers. This betrayal drove Bonifacio and other Katipunan leaders to Balintawak. On August 23, he summoned Katipunan leaders to a meeting at the yard of Tantang Sora, mother of the Katipunan. The Katipuneros tore their cedulas apart, yelling, "Long live the Philippines!" as a sign of their independence from Spain. The first real encounter between the Spanish forces and the Katipunan took place. This proclaimed existence of a state of war and the Batallón de Leales Voluntarios de Manila in the cities and provinces of the Philippines. The government launched a series of executions including Los 13 Martires de Cavite. One deeply felt by the Filipinos was Jose Rizal's execution on December 30, 1896. But within this revolution, rebels in Cavite under Emilio Aguinaldo, mayor of Kawit, were already thinking of placing themselves as a directing center of the revolution. The two rival provincial councils of Katipunan being Magdiwang, led by Mariano Alvarez, and Magdalo, led by Baldomero Aguinaldo. Despite Baldomero's presence in Magdalo, it was Emilio who was its leading light. Aguinaldo released two manifestos which plainly identified Magdalo and Aguinaldo as the revolution's new leaders, to which other cities and provinces were expected to comply. On a local level, this order was also geared towards the Magdiwang. While Bonifacio faced setbacks after several defeats, his reputation deteriorated during a period when the Aguinaldo and the Caviteño rebels gained prominence in the region as a result of their triumphs. Magdiwang and Magdalo feud brought Bonifacio to Cavite to intercede. Upon his arrival, he was despised and disrespected by Magdalo officials. Baldemoro then advocated a new revolutionary government at the Imus Assembly with Magdiwang Magdalo partisans. The Magdiwang and Magdalo councils gathered at Tejeros, San Francisco de Malabon, which was known as the Tejeros Convention. Gathering leaders chose the new government's official without consulting Katipunan Council, and the Caviteños victoriously won in the election. Aguinaldo received the revolution's greatest honor, while Bonifacio was driven out. The rivalry between Magdalo and Magdiwang was resolved by booting out non-Caviteño and sharing the honor among themselves. Enraged, Bonifacio proclaimed the assembly and its decisions null and void. Aguinaldo's position gave him legality and power. Those who were allies abandoned Bonifacio and turned against him, giving false testimonies to the court. With these testimonies, Aguinaldo ordered Colonel Agapito Ponson to arrest Bonifacio and his brothers charged with sedition and treason. It was prejudice, as President Aguinaldo was his enemy, and all of the other witnesses were Bonifacio's former allies turned foes. It gave an impression that the man was guilty. On May 8, Aguinaldo reduced the death penalty to exile, but General Noriel and Del Pilar convinced him to reinstate the death penalty. On May 10, Major Lazaro Macapagal carried out Noriel's order to execute Bonifacio. It was evident that Bonifacio became a danger to the Cavite's leadership, which sought to gain control of the whole revolution. Aguinaldo's moment of triumph was short-lived. Towns of Cavite quickly fell to the Spaniards. The brutal fight of May 3 to 17 caused Aguinaldo to withdraw until Cavite was recaptured by the Spanish. He then relocated his headquarters to Biak-na-Bato in San Miguel, Bulacan. Malabar, Aguinaldo's manifesto advocating defiance to Spain for an indefinite period exhausted their resources and obliged them to surrender from poverty and to treat peninsular and insular civilians equal, expelling friars and abolished the government authorities' power directed to unjust measures against Filipinos. These demands were strange, for they were all premised on the continuation of Spanish sovereignty. Far from the goals of Katipunan under Bonifacio, separation from Spain, independence. Simultaneous attacks of the insurgents happened against the Spaniards. But even as the people fought, Aguinaldo had already negotiated with the enemy as early as August. A prominent lawyer descended from Chinese mestizo, Pedro A. Paterno, volunteered his services, for he had the right credentials for both sides as a mediator. In return for money, Aguinaldo ordered the release of Spanish captives. Aguinaldo vowed to give up all arms if the money were provided. As soon as he had the funds, he asked to live freely under Spanish protection. The Spanish government agreed to pay 800,000 pesos if Aguinaldo and his companions went into voluntary exile, which Aguinaldo did on December 27 as he and his companions left to Hong Kong. The Spaniards also requested that he issue a proclamation expressing his sincere desire to assist the Spanish government in the pacification of the Philippine Islands, which Aguinaldo did. It is now clear that the people's sacrifices were to be used merely as leverage in the negotiations. The Biak-na-Bato agreement was a disgraceful rejection of what the revolution stood for. People who remained at Biak-na-Bato made a petition for the indemnity of those who have suffered personal losses. They divided the money given by the Governor-General among themselves. This quarrel over spoils infuriated Aguinaldo, who convened a meeting of the Supreme Council members living in Hong Kong as he chose new council members from among the exiles, ousting those remaining in Biak-na-Bato whom Aguinaldo saw as traitors. Even at Aguinaldo's departure, the revolution practically never ended nor eased. It was still prominent, and his authority and threats did not deter the displaced men at Biak-na-Bato. Many revolutionary leaders captured and held cities, murdering or imprisoning Guardia Civil, friars, and other Spanish captives. Continuous attacks of the rebels made Spaniards realize that the movement was a conscious effort to achieve the goal of the old Katipunan. Simultaneous revolution in Cuba and in the Philippines against the Spanish gave opportunity for Americans to impose its own rule in both countries and declare a war against Spain after an American warship was mysteriously blown up in Havana Harbor. Aguinaldo was promised by an American official that he would not regret partnering with the Americans and that the US would not want the Philippines. But these tricky promises were doubted by Aguinaldo and junta since they had not placed anything in writing. But still, he trusted them with his might. As soon as he landed in the Philippines, the people immediately embraced his leadership and resumed the war with the same intensity. Spain's colonialism, American imperialism, the Ilustrados, and the Filipino people dominated the historical stage. The first three engaged in a sequence of interconnected maneuvers to secure mass dominance over the Filipinos. The people continued to support the Katipunan's revolutionary ideals, but they misunderstood the true character of Americans. Spaniards were their enemy, but they only heard of America through their leader. A decree urging protection of the lives and property of all foreigners and the proper treatment of prisoners was issued in fulfillment of Aguinaldo's promises to conduct a civilized war. On the same date, Aguinaldo proclaimed a dictatorial government. His actions were puppet-like, willingly obeying his foreign masters. Spaniards tried to once again proclaim the land, but were dismayed by failure. Aguinaldo continued his moves by proclaiming Philippine independence on June 12, 1898, in Kawit, at which the Philippine flag was first officially raised and the Philippine national anthem first publicly played. A declaration was also prepared stating the Americans as the protectorate of the free and independent Philippines. Dictatorial government changed to a revolutionary government on June 23, 1898, as Mabini saw the Declaration of Independence as premature and lacking a mass participation. Aguinaldo again became president, emerging as a central figure of the struggle. Announcing the collapse of Biak-na-Bato and canceling all its instructions was another step, plainly geared at cementing his control. This proclamation also nullified all other resistance leaders and made all posts his own. Americans were pleased, using the Filipinos to fight the Spaniards until the American troops arrived. American generals began to treat their supposed allies arrogantly, demanding the Filipino troops vacate certain areas. Aguinaldo, although resented the general's order, accommodated the Americans. Manila had been under siege by the Spaniards since May 31. The two colonial powers agreed to perform a mock battle, followed by the surrender of Manila to US soldiers, with no Filipino troops allowed to enter Manila. On August 13, Manila surrendered after a simulated fight. The Filipino soldiers fought with the Americans, unknowing that they had been sold off. Aguinaldo continued to occupy himself with the establishment of his government, appointing elite men once more. It did not matter that most of these men had no experiences in Spanish camp. His second coup, accomplished under American sponsorship, opened the way for the takeover of the Manila elite. Thus, Pedro A. Paterno was now president of the Revolutionary Congress. The inclusion of these members in the revolutionary government reflected the revolution's triumph. However, the fear of another economically damaging war against the Americans encountered the thoughts of the Congress. They are willing to be submissive to prevent another chaos. Meanwhile, the war against Spain met with success. Provinces far from Manila drove the Spaniards away on their own without the aid of Aguinaldo's expeditions. On December 10, 1898, the Spain signed the Treaty of Paris, ceding the Philippines to the US. The Filipinos had won their freedom struggle.
During the Malolos festivities of Philippine independence, Aguinaldo demonstrated the ascendancy of the Manila elite. On January 23, 1899, the elites led the First Philippine Republic into existence. Aguinaldo then took the oath of office as Philippine President. During his reign, serious indications of elite orientation and self-gratification were evident. The regime's first two decrees focused on releasing non-military Spanish prisoners and allowing Spaniards and other foreigners to do business in the country. The people felt betrayed as the regime only acknowledged those who are affluent, supported by a law of administering estates. Further, their goal of centralization did not anticipate America's goal of colonization, as President McKinley's issue of benevolent assimilation kept the administration unaware through his honeyed words. In addition to the U.S. declaration, there was no attempt to maintain Philippine sovereignty since signing the Paris Treaty and Declaration. On San Juan Bridge on February 4, 1899, an American patrol shot and killed a Filipino soldier. General MacArthur had ordered his troops to advance despite no investigation. Aguinaldo, on the other hand, argued that war was unnecessary. Despair forced Aguinaldo to warn his people of impending war. After the Paris Treaty was ratified, this allowed the Americans to conquer their new colony. Despite some Philippine victories, the Americans achieved their initial goal. The Sherman Commission declared U.S. supremacy on April 4, 1899. Despite Mabini's manifesto's call to continue the struggle, Aguinaldo rejected it, pledged by Paterno and Buencamino, which has caused his cabinet to disband. General Antonio Luna had become a threat to both Paterno and Aguinaldo, resulting in the repetition of Bonifacio's fate. The idea of Luna succeeding Aguinaldo enraged him, which led to an ambush of Luna by the Kawit Company, resulting in his death. The begging of the masses had become irrelevant to the current regime as they prioritized negotiations on autonomy. Despite their pleas, more emphasis was placed on giving the people a democratic party than fighting for independence. Throughout Aguinaldo's odyssey, the people's unrest fired back against him. Aguinaldo had to flee from place to place due to America's full-scale offensive. Though many had died, Aguinaldo was welcomed in most places he went with a small group. The guerrilla warfare grew in popularity along with Aguinaldo's disappearance. However, General Frederick von Stone captured Aguinaldo on March 23, 1901, despite his contacts with guerrilla commanders. On April 1st, Aguinaldo swore allegiance to the USA. Thereafter, he declared he would only serve the people, but through his love for America on April 19. The lack of clarity on welfare undermines the masses' desire for independence. Instead, the Ilustrados' goal was and is to protect their own. Aguinaldo, wanting to fight for the people, was more than willing to negotiate with the Americans, praising their good intentions and praising their former foes. He had misread his people and redirected their faith in him, but he only stood apart from the people to protect and enhance their economic privileges. The horrendous journey of the Filipinos had exhibited a painful footprint of the past. The identity behind them had progressed and delivered a sense of sovereignty only for a short time. This progression had caused a building block and deterioration to the citizens that despite their only aim towards inheriting the independence that the colonizers had taken from them, bloodshed and injustice were prevalent. Notwithstanding the rise of the people, referred to as the nation's heroes, the greed of other rising personalities had hindered resulting further execution. Behind every mask of the affluent was their desire towards self-gain and partial to that of the Filipinos' behalf.
These 3 chapters sought to impart that as long as greed and thirst for power circulates the blood of those who rule, repetition of our history is not impossible. And we, Filipinos, given with an insufferable past, should be educated enough not to be fooled around by another form of Aguinaldo, a narcissistic power-craving creature disguised as another entity in the government. Given the power of democratic choices, it is our job today not to be a pawn to someone's power trips.